400 million years ago, the oceans followed completely different rules. Fish looked nothing like the sleek creatures we know today. Some were massive living tanks, their bodies wrapped head to tail in thick, rigid armor that made every move heavy and powerful. Others had no teeth at all, yet they still hunted like apex predators, cutting through flesh in shocking ways. Nothing worked the way it does in our modern seas. Jaws had only just appeared, and every group of fish seemed to experiment with them differently. No single style had taken over yet. On land, life was still tiny and simple, just low green sprouts with no real forests in sight. But underwater, pressure was building fast. Armor grew thicker, hunters grew stronger, entire communities formed around creatures that have no living equivalents today. Raw, experimental predators shaped by a world that hadn't settled into stable patterns. This was the Devonian, the age of fishes, and for roughly 70 million years, these armored forms dominated almost every ocean and river on Earth. And then, almost out of nowhere, they all vanished, while the sharks that shared their seas survived and are still with us today. But what were these creatures, really? Why did evolution build something so strange and then erase it so completely? If these deep time explorations excite you, smash that like button and subscribe so we can keep uncovering more lost worlds together. And tell me right now in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? It's always cool to see how far these stories reach. Alright, let's go back 400 million years. Long before familiar coastlines settled into place, the surface of the planet carried a different arrangement. One where water stretched far inland and continents appeared fragmented, softened at their edges by shallow seas that pressed gently across them. Between roughly 419 and 359 million years ago, this world entered a phase that would later be recognized not for stillness, but for expansion, as life within the oceans began to diversify with a quiet intensity that reshaped the fabric of ecosystems. The seas themselves were warm, holding a steadiness that allowed biological processes to unfold without the sharp interruptions seen in colder or more volatile ages. Light filtered easily through these shallow waters, illuminating vast continental shelves that had become submerged beneath rising sea levels. These regions formed wide, sunlit habitats where movement, feeding, and reproduction could occur in close proximity, creating an environment where interactions between organisms became more frequent and more complex over time. Across these submerged plains, early marine communities began to thicken. Life did not simply exist, it layered, intertwined, and adapted in response to the presence of others. Fish, in forms both simple and increasingly specialized, moved through these waters in growing numbers. Some remained small and unobtrusive, while others developed structures that hinted at new possibilities, bodies that were beginning to explore strength, speed, and resilience in ways not previously seen. Above the waterline, the land remained comparatively sparse. Early plants had started to anchor themselves along river margins and damp soils, extending upward in modest forms that had yet to dominate the landscape. There were no forests as they would later be known, only the first quiet attempts at greening the continents. Small arthropods moved cautiously across this emerging terrain, their presence subtle against the vastness of bare ground and rock. The imbalance between land and sea created a kind of asymmetry in the story of life. While the continents waited, the oceans carried momentum. Within them, evolutionary change accelerated, not through sudden leaps, but through continuous refinement. Structures became more efficient, movements more directed, and interactions more deliberate. The abundance of shallow habitats allowed species to spread, isolate, and diverge, each variation adding another layer to an already expanding network of life. This period would come to be known as the Age of Fishes, a name that reflects not a single dominant species, but an explosion of forms that occupied nearly every available niche. Some drifted close to the seafloor, others navigated open water, and many existed somewhere in between, adapting to gradients of light, pressure, and predation. Diversity was not evenly distributed, it clustered and shifted, responding to subtle changes in environment and competition. The chemistry of the oceans supported this growth. Oxygen levels, though not constant, were sufficient to sustain active organisms, while nutrients circulated through currents that connected distant regions. These unseen patterns influenced where life could thrive and where it would struggle, shaping distribution without visible boundaries. In this setting, the foundations of later marine ecosystems were quietly assembled. Relationships between predator and prey, between structure and function, and between environment and adaptation began to settle into patterns that would echo far beyond this era. The Devonian world did not yet resemble the oceans that exist today, but within its warm, shallow expanses, the essential dynamics of marine life were being written with increasing clarity. It did not rely on rows of teeth or the familiar mechanics of tearing flesh. Instead, its mouth closed with the precision of moving plates, edges of bone meeting in a clean, decisive motion that carried both weight and control. In creatures such as Dunkleosteus, the absence of teeth was not a limitation, but a different solution, one that turned the very structure of the skull into a cutting instrument shaped by pressure and repetition over time. The front of the jaws formed thick, interlocking plates, sharpened not by replacement as seen in later animals, but through constant use. Each closure refined their edges, maintaining a surface capable of slicing through resistant material. These bony margins did not dull in the way softer structures might. Instead, they preserved a functional sharpness, as though the act of feeding itself sustained their effectiveness. The motion was direct, without hesitation, and carried a force that did not need serration to succeed. Beneath this outward simplicity lay a system built for power. The musculature attached to these armored skulls allowed for a rapid release of stored energy, bringing the plates together with remarkable speed. Measurements drawn from fossil reconstructions suggest forces strong enough to fracture other armored bodies, compressing and breaking through defenses that had once offered protection in earlier stages of marine life. What had evolved as armor in one lineage became a challenge answered by pressure in another, the interaction unfolding without the need for pointed teeth. Yet the action did not begin with the bite itself. Before the plates ever met, there was a sudden expansion of the jaw, a swift opening that displaced water and created a brief but powerful suction. This movement drew nearby prey inward, reducing the need for prolonged pursuit and aligning the target precisely within the closing arc of the jaws. The sequence was efficient, a combination of intake and compression that minimized wasted motion and maximized control over the encounter. This approach to predation existed outside the patterns that would later dominate marine ecosystems. There was no slicing through repeated sawing motions, no reliance on replaceable structures that could be shed and renewed. Instead, the head itself functioned as both framework and weapon, a unified system where form and function were inseparable. It represented a stage in evolutionary design where multiple possibilities were still being explored, where solutions could emerge that would not persist, yet remained fully effective within their own context. Around such predators, the surrounding life adjusted accordingly. Bodies that carried armor had once moved with a certain assurance, but in the presence of crushing force, that assurance shifted into a different kind of balance. Survival no longer depended solely on resisting damage, but on avoiding the moment of contact altogether. Movement patterns, positioning, and awareness became as important as physical defense, each small adjustment shaping how life continued within these waters. The absence of teeth, then, did not signal an incomplete design. It marked a divergence, a path where cutting edges were carved from bone and strength replaced repetition. In that divergence, a distinct form of predation emerged, one that would leave its imprint not through continuity, but through the quiet evidence preserved in stone, where pressure and motion are still recorded in the shape of ancient jaws. Weight gathered along the body in deliberate layers, not as decoration, but as structure that altered how these creatures moved through their world. Thick, bony plating formed across the head and forward regions, overlapping in segments that shielded the most vulnerable areas while leaving the rest of the body to remain flexible enough for motion. This arrangement did not create invulnerability, but it introduced resistance, a way of enduring encounters that might otherwise end quickly in softer forms. The plates themselves were composed of dense tissues, built through gradual mineralization that strengthened over generations. They did not simply sit upon the surface, they integrated into the body's framework, anchoring to underlying structures and distributing force across a broader area. When pressure met this armor, it did not focus on a single point but spread, reducing the likelihood of immediate failure. In this way, protection became a matter of redirection as much as durability. Yet every addition of mass carried a consequence. Movement through water depends on balance, on the ability to generate thrust without excessive resistance, and heavily armored bodies encountered limits that lighter forms could avoid. Acceleration slowed, turning required more effort, and prolonged swimming demanded greater energy. These creatures did not glide with ease, they advanced with intention, each motion shaped by the weight they carried. Within this constraint, different strategies began to take form. Some species leaned further into protection, accepting reduced speed in exchange for increased survival during direct encounters. Others retained only partial armor, shielding key regions while leaving more of the body unencumbered, preserving a degree of agility. This variation did not resolve into a single solution. It spread outward, creating a range of forms that occupied different positions along the balance between defense and movement. The presence of such defenses did not go unnoticed by those that fed upon them. As protective structures became more effective, predatory approaches adjusted in response. Force increased, methods shifted, and the interaction between hunter and prey began to take on a more reciprocal nature. Each improvement in defense encouraged a corresponding refinement in attack, not through sudden change, but through a steady pressure that guided development over long spans of time. Prey species, too, participated in this unfolding dynamic. Some developed their own forms of armor, constructing external layers that mirrored, in simpler ways, the protection seen in larger organisms. Others adopted different solutions, altering behavior rather than structure, seeking to avoid confrontation rather than withstand it. The presence of armor did not eliminate vulnerability, it reshaped it, creating new patterns of risk and survival. This ongoing adjustment between opposing needs formed an early expression of what would later be understood as an evolutionary arms race. No single trait remained sufficient for long, as each advantage introduced a new challenge from the surrounding environment. Stability did not emerge from dominance alone, but from the continuous interplay between competing adaptations, each influencing the direction of the other. Over time, the heavily armored forms came to define a distinct presence within these waters. Their bodies carried the record of pressures applied and resisted, of encounters survived and forces endured. They did not move with the lightness of later fish, nor did they require it. Within their own context, weight and protection formed a coherent design, one that reflected the conditions of a world still refining the balance between strength and motion. Not all hunters moved with certainty, and not all strikes followed a perfected design. In this earlier chapter of the ocean's history, predation existed in forms that felt unfinished, as though each encounter carried a trace of trial within it. Bodies shifted, structures adjusted, and feeding was less a fixed behavior than a process still taking shape across generations. The emergence of jaws marked a quiet turning point within this unfolding system. Formed through gradual modification of existing structures, they introduced a new way of interacting with the environment, allowing organisms to grasp, hold, and manipulate rather than simply filter or absorb. This capability did not arrive fully refined. It appeared first in varied forms, some strong but imprecise, others delicate yet adaptable, each reflecting a different path toward control over food. Among these early predators, diversity extended beyond appearance into method. Some developed forward-facing mouths that closed with force, aligning body and movement toward direct capture. Others relied on smaller, more frequent motions, taking advantage of size or agility rather than strength. A number of species remained opportunistic, feeding on whatever drifted within reach, while others began to focus on particular types of prey, narrowing their approach in exchange for greater efficiency. This variation did not settle into a stable pattern. Instead, it produced a shifting field of interactions where success depended on timing, positioning, and the subtle alignment of form with function. A structure that proved effective in one setting might falter in another, and so change continued, guided by outcomes that accumulated slowly but persistently over time. As these new feeding strategies spread, the surrounding environment responded. Prey species encountered a wider range of threats, each requiring a different form of response. Movement became more deliberate, sensory awareness more refined, and the spaces between organisms carried a different weight. Encounters that might once have been incidental began to take on greater consequence, shaping behavior as much as anatomy. Competition followed naturally from this increase in interaction. Resources that had once been abundant and easily accessed became points of convergence, drawing multiple species into proximity. In these shared spaces, differences in feeding method and efficiency became more pronounced. Some organisms gained advantage through speed, others through strength, and still others through persistence, each occupying a niche that overlapped with others in complex and often shifting ways. Within this environment, specialization began to emerge alongside generality. Certain predators adapted to particular prey, refining their structures and behaviors to match a narrower range of targets. This focus brought increased effectiveness, but also a degree of dependence, tying survival to the continued presence of specific conditions. At the same time, more flexible species maintained broader diets, sacrificing peak efficiency in favor of resilience across changing circumstances. The ocean, once defined by simpler exchanges, grew more intricate as these patterns layered upon one another. Feeding was no longer a passive process. It became an active negotiation between opposing needs, each encounter shaped by the capabilities of both participants. The presence of jaws in all their early variations accelerated this shift, transforming interactions into moments of selection that echoed forward through generations. In this way, predation did not arrive as a finished system. It emerged through accumulation, through repeated attempts that gradually refined what it meant to hunt and to survive. The forms seen in this time carried the imprint of that ongoing invention, each one a record of possibilities explored within a world still learning how to sustain its own complexity. At some point within this long unfolding, the rhythm of the ocean began to quicken, not through a single event, but through a gradual shift in how life interacted with itself. What had once been dominated by slower exchanges, where organisms gathered nutrients from their surroundings with minimal conflict, began to give way to a system shaped by pursuit, capture, and resistance. The change did not announce itself, yet its effects spread through every layer of the marine world. Feeding, once largely passive, became increasingly active. Organisms no longer relied solely on what drifted within reach or settled beneath them. Movement gained purpose, directed not just toward survival, but toward acquisition. Bodies adapted to close distance, to intercept, to secure. The space between individuals, once a neutral expanse, transformed into a field of interaction where timing and precision began to matter. As these behaviors took hold, encounters between species grew more frequent and more consequential. Each meeting carried a clearer outcome, one that shaped not only the individuals involved, but the patterns of life around them. Predators refined their approaches, while prey adjusted in response, and this continuous exchange began to ripple outward, influencing how populations expanded or diminished over time. With this shift came a change in how energy moved through the ecosystem. Instead of flowing slowly through layers of organisms that processed it with minimal disruption, energy began to transfer more rapidly, passing from one body to another through direct interaction. Consumption became a primary pathway, linking species together in chains that extended across different depths and habitats. These connections did not remain fixed. They shifted as conditions changed, forming and dissolving in response to subtle variations in environment and behavior. The structure of the ocean's food systems reflected this new dynamism. Relationships between species grew more intricate, no longer defined by simple hierarchies, but by networks that adjusted continuously. A change in one part of this system could influence others at a distance, altering balances that had once appeared stable. The result was not disorder, but a different kind of order, one that depended on constant adjustment rather than steady equilibrium. Within this evolving framework, stability became more temporary. Populations rose and fell with greater sensitivity to shifts in interaction, and the success of a species often depended on its ability to respond to changes beyond its immediate control. Adaptation extended beyond physical form into patterns of behavior, distribution, and timing, each factor contributing to how life persisted within a more active environment. These developments did not erase what came before, but they layered new dynamics upon existing foundations. Traces of earlier, slower systems remained, particularly in regions where conditions still favored them, yet they existed alongside a growing complexity that continued to expand. The ocean carried both its past and its emerging future at once, each influencing the other in subtle ways. In this way, the transformation unfolded without interruption, carried forward by countless interactions that collectively altered the nature of marine life. The ocean became a place where movement held greater consequence, where contact between organisms shaped the flow of existence, and where the pace of life, though still measured in deep time, began to reflect a world in which change could travel more quickly through the living network. Scale emerged quietly, not as a sudden leap, but as a gradual stretching of form that allowed certain bodies to extend beyond the limits that had once defined them. In these waters, some predators grew to lengths approaching 10 meters, Their presence marked less by speed than by the space they occupied and the influence they exerted on everything around them. Among these, Dunkleosteus stood as one of the most prominent, its structure carrying both weight and intent through a design that favored strength over refinement. Its body did not rely on elegance. The forward region, reinforced and compact, gave way to a rear that provided propulsion in steady, deliberate movements. This balance allowed it to navigate its environment with control, conserving energy while maintaining the ability to close distance when necessary. It did not need constant motion to remain effective. Its size alone altered the behavior of surrounding organisms, shaping movement patterns and creating zones where smaller life adjusted without direct contact. Within this role, it occupied a position that would later be recognized as that of an apex predator. There were few, if any, organisms capable of challenging it directly, and its feeding behavior reflected this absence of constraint. It did not compete in the same way as smaller hunters, nor did it rely on avoidance. Instead, it existed as a central presence within its ecosystem, influencing not only individual encounters, but the broader distribution of life within its range. Fossil evidence offers quiet confirmation of this role. Remains of other armored fish have been found bearing marks that align with the crushing capabilities of Dunkleosteus, fractures that suggest encounters where protection was overcome by force. In some specimens, partially consumed bodies appear, preserved in association, indicating moments where feeding was interrupted and recorded in the sediment. These traces do not capture movement or sound, yet they preserve the outcomes of interactions that once unfolded within living systems. The growth to such size required a consistent intake of energy, linking this predator to the broader network of life that sustained it. Its presence depended on the abundance of prey, and in turn, it regulated that abundance through its feeding. This relationship formed a loop, subtle yet persistent, where the success of one level influenced the structure of those below it. In this way, dominance was not isolated, it was embedded within a larger system that both supported and was shaped by it. Other large predators existed alongside it, each contributing to a layered hierarchy that added depth to the ecosystem. They did not mirror one another exactly, differing in form and method, yet they shared a reliance on size and strength as primary tools. Together, they established a scale of interaction that extended beyond the smaller exchanges of earlier times, introducing a dimension where encounters carried greater impact. The presence of such hunters did not create stillness, but a different kind of movement, one defined by awareness and adjustment. Smaller organisms navigated these waters with patterns that reflected the distribution of larger forms, while mid-level predators balanced their own needs within this shifting landscape. The result was an environment shaped not only by individual actions, but by the cumulative influence of those that stood at its uppermost levels. In the preserved outlines of these ancient bodies, a record remains of a time when size and strength combined to define a new kind of presence in the ocean, one that would echo forward as later lineages refined and reinterpreted the role of the largest hunters. There were few moments of stillness for smaller bodies moving through these waters, not because motion was constant, but because the possibility of contact never fully receded. Presence itself carried a kind of tension, a quiet awareness that movement, position, and timing all held consequence within an environment shaped by layered predation. To exist as prey within this system meant responding to more than a single threat. Different predators approached from different depths and directions, each with its own method, its own rhythm. Some relied on sudden bursts, others on steady approach, and others still on proximity that went unnoticed until distance had already closed. This variety created a field of pressure that was not fixed but shifting, requiring continuous adjustment rather than a single solution. Bodies adapted accordingly, not through a uniform response, but through divergence. Some species developed greater speed, refining fin structures and muscular coordination to allow rapid changes in direction. Their movements became less predictable, weaving through space in patterns that reduced the chance of interception. Others leaned toward protection, forming external layers that increased resistance to attack, accepting a reduction in mobility in exchange for durability during contact. There were also those that relied on concealment rather than confrontation. Subtle changes in coloration allowed them to blend with their surroundings, reducing visibility against the textures of the seafloor or the gradients of open water. Behavior played a role as well, with certain organisms remaining close to structures or moving in ways that minimized attention. In these strategies, survival depended less on outrunning or resisting and more on remaining unnoticed within a complex visual environment. These adaptations extended beyond individual encounters into the broader patterns of life cycles. Reproduction, growth, and movement were all shaped by the need to persist within a system where loss was frequent. Some species produced large numbers of offspring, increasing the likelihood that a portion would survive despite constant predation. Others invested in fewer individuals, supporting their development through stages that improved their chances of reaching maturity. Timing became critical, with certain behaviors aligned to periods when risk was reduced, even if only slightly. As these patterns took hold, early forms of evasive behavior emerged with increasing clarity. Movements were no longer purely reactive, they began to anticipate. A shift in water, a subtle change in light, or the presence of nearby organisms could trigger adjustments that occurred before direct contact. This awareness did not eliminate danger, but it altered how encounters unfolded, introducing moments where outcome could be influenced by perception as much as by physical capability. Groups formed in some species, creating coordinated movement that reduced the likelihood of any single individual being targeted. Within these clusters, patterns of alignment and spacing created a collective response where changes in direction propagated through the group in fluid, continuous motion. This did not remove risk, but it distributed it, shaping the dynamics of interaction in ways that extended beyond solitary behavior. The presence of multiple predators ensured that no single strategy remained sufficient across all conditions. Speed, armor, concealment, and coordination each offered advantages, yet each carried limitations that became apparent under different forms of pressure. Survival, then, emerged from a balance of traits and behaviors, each contributing to persistence within an environment defined by constant interaction. In this setting, to be prey was not a passive state. It required continuous engagement with the surrounding world, a steady refinement of form and behavior that allowed life to continue within a system where every movement carried meaning, and where existence itself depended on the ability to adapt within an ever-shifting network of threats and responses. Long before their silhouettes would come to define open water, the earliest sharks moved through these seas as one presence among many, neither rare nor dominant, but part of a broader assembly of forms still negotiating their place. Their bodies carried a different logic, one that contrasted with the heavier constructions that had come to characterize many of the larger inhabitants. Where others bore rigid coverings and reinforced fronts, these early sharks held a lighter framework, built from cartilage rather than dense bone, allowing a flexibility that shaped how they moved and responded to their surroundings. This difference in structure extended beyond material into motion. Their bodies curved more easily, producing smoother propulsion that required less force to maintain. Instead of advancing with measured effort, they could sustain longer periods of movement, gliding through water with an efficiency that did not rely on sudden bursts alone. Their fins, positioned to stabilize and steer, contributed to a style of swimming that favored continuity over interruption, allowing them to explore spaces that demanded endurance rather than strength. At this stage, however, such traits did not yet place them at the center of the ecosystem. The dominant roles remained with other groups whose forms had already established a strong presence. These earlier inhabitants occupied key positions, shaping interactions through size, protection, and force. The sharks, by contrast, existed alongside them, adapting quietly, their advantages not yet fully expressed within the larger structure of marine life. Even so, subtle shifts were already underway. The efficiency of cartilage, the reduction of excess weight, and the refinement of movement began to offer benefits in contexts where energy conservation and sustained activity mattered. These traits did not replace existing strategies, but they introduced alternatives, expanding the range of possible responses to the pressures present within the environment. As these forms persisted, competition began to take on new dimensions. It was no longer defined solely by direct confrontation or immediate outcomes. Instead, it extended into how organisms used space, how long they could remain active, and how effectively they could locate and secure food over time. In this broader sense, different body plans began to express different solutions, each interacting with the same environment through distinct methods. The coexistence of these groups created a layered system where no single design held complete advantage. Heavier, more protected forms retained strength in close encounters, while lighter, more flexible bodies found success through efficiency and adaptability. These differences did not resolve quickly. They unfolded gradually, with outcomes shaped by conditions that varied across regions and over time. Within this ongoing interaction, the early sharks continued to refine their approach. Their sensory systems, their patterns of movement, and their feeding behaviors adjusted in ways that aligned with their structural advantages. These changes were not dramatic, yet they accumulated, forming a foundation that would later support a broader expansion. The ocean at this moment held both established dominance and emerging potential. The balance had not yet shifted, but it was no longer fixed. Beneath the surface, a quiet transition had begun, carried not by sudden replacement, but by the steady presence of forms whose design allowed them to respond to change with a different kind of resilience. In the interplay between these groups, the future shape of marine life started to take form, not through a single turning point, but through a gradual reweaving of roles, where new possibilities moved alongside older structures, each leaving its mark on the evolving system. Forms appeared that no longer have a clear echo in the present, shapes that seem unfamiliar even when traced carefully through stone. Their outlines suggest combinations that feel almost improbable, as though different design paths were explored at once before any single direction settled into continuity. These creatures moved through their environments with structures that do not align neatly with those seen today, carrying arrangements of plates, fins, and proportions that belong to a wider field of experimentation. Some bore extended armor that reached beyond the head, creating silhouettes that shifted the balance between rigidity and movement in unusual ways. Others displayed asymmetries or elongated features that altered how they navigated space, their bodies tuned to conditions that no longer persist. There were forms that hovered near the boundary between bottom and open water, neither fully adapted to one nor the other, yet capable of sustaining themselves within that overlap for long stretches of time. These designs were not brief anomalies. Many endured for millions of years, maintaining stable populations and interacting effectively within their ecosystems. Their presence shaped local dynamics, influencing how other species fed, moved, and adapted. In their own context, they were not transitional or incomplete, but fully realized expressions of what life could become under specific conditions. The persistence of such forms reflects a broader pattern within evolution, one where multiple solutions can coexist without immediate convergence. Rather than progressing along a single path, life expands outward, exploring variations that respond to particular pressures. Some of these variations lead to lineages that continue and diversify, while others remain confined to narrower circumstances, their success tied closely to the environments that support them. As conditions shift, these dependencies become more apparent. A form that once functioned effectively may find its advantages reduced when surrounding factors change. Alterations in water chemistry, in available resources, or in the composition of other species can gradually undermine structures that had previously offered stability. The process does not occur abruptly. It unfolds through incremental changes that accumulate over time, narrowing the range of conditions under which certain designs can persist. In this gradual narrowing, some of the more unusual forms begin to recede. Their disappearance does not erase their impact, but it leaves behind a record that feels incomplete when viewed from the present. Without direct descendants, their structures stand apart, offering insight into possibilities that were explored but not carried forward. They remain as markers of variation, evidence that the path of life has included branches that did not extend into later eras. The ocean during this period held a richness of form that exceeded what would eventually remain. Diversity was not only a matter of number, but of difference, with body plans diverging in ways that reflected a wide range of adaptive strategies. This diversity did not resolve into permanence. It shifted, contracted, and reorganized as new conditions emerged and others faded. In this ongoing process, dominance revealed its temporary nature. A form could hold influence for vast spans of time, shaping the structure of its environment and the behavior of other organisms, yet still give way as the broader system evolved. What remained was not a fixed hierarchy, but a continuous transformation where presence and absence both contributed to the unfolding story. These vanished creatures, preserved in fragments and impressions, offer a glimpse into that wider field of possibility, where life moved through variations that were once stable, once effective, and now exist only as distant traces within the deeper layers of Earth's history. Before there was a clear separation between breathing and feeding, the front of the body carried structures that served a more fluid purpose. Arches that supported the movement of water across delicate surfaces where exchange occurred. These early frameworks, positioned near the head, were not yet specialized for grasping or biting. They flexed and held form in ways that maintained flow, shaping a rhythm that sustained life through contact with the surrounding medium. Over long stretches of time, subtle shifts began to alter these arches. Small changes in shape and attachment accumulated across generations, guided by variations that proved useful within particular conditions. Certain segments thickened, others gained mobility, and the alignment of these elements began to favor not only the passage of water, but the ability to close and hold. This transformation did not happen all at once. It unfolded through incremental adjustments, each one modest on its own, yet significant when carried forward. As these structures continued to change, the boundary between respiration and feeding grew more defined. The forward arches, once primarily involved in guiding water, began to take on a new role. Their movement became more controlled, capable of closing with enough precision to capture and retain material, rather than simply allowing it to pass through. This marked the early formation of jaws, a development that introduced a different kind of interaction between organism and environment. With this new capability came a widening of possibility. Organisms were no longer limited to what could be filtered or absorbed. They could select, grasp, and process a broader range of food sources. This shift did not replace earlier methods entirely, but it added a layer of complexity that allowed for new strategies to emerge. Feeding became more directed, and in that direction came opportunities for diversification. The surrounding anatomy adjusted in response. Muscles adapted to support the opening and closing of these new structures, while sensory systems began to align with the need to locate and secure specific targets. The coordination between movement and perception grew more refined, creating a feedback loop where successful interactions reinforced the traits that made them possible. Over time, this integration shaped bodies that were increasingly suited to active engagement with their environment. Different lineages explored this capability in their own ways. Some developed strong, forceful closures suited for handling resistant material, while others maintained lighter, more flexible arrangements that allowed for quicker, more precise movements. These variations did not converge immediately. Instead, they spread outward, contributing to a growing diversity of forms that reflected different approaches to the same fundamental innovation. The emergence of jaws also influenced relationships between organisms, as some gained the ability to grasp and process others more effectively. The dynamics of interaction shifted. New forms of predation became possible, and with them, new forms of response. This interplay contributed to the broader changes already unfolding within the ocean, adding another dimension to the evolving network of life. In the deeper record of vertebrate history, this transformation stands as a pivotal moment, not because it introduced a single dominant form, but because it expanded the range of what could be achieved. The modification of gill structures into jaws illustrates how existing frameworks can be reshaped to serve new purposes, allowing life to explore pathways that were previously inaccessible. From these beginnings, the diversity of jawed vertebrates would continue to grow, carrying forward the legacy of those early changes. The arches that once guided water had become instruments of interaction, and through them, the course of life on Earth shifted in ways that continue to resonate across the living world. Across certain stretches of the ancient seafloor, small accumulations began to rise, built not from rock alone, but from the slow, continuous activity of living organisms layering upon one another. These formations grew upward and outward, creating structures that interrupted the otherwise open expanse, offering surfaces, shelter, and variation where there had once been relative uniformity. Early coral communities, along with other reef-building life, contributed to these growing frameworks, forming intricate shapes that extended into the surrounding water. Within these structures, space became divided into countless small environments. Crevices, overhangs, and sheltered pockets allowed organisms to occupy positions that differed in light, flow, and exposure. This physical complexity supported an increase in biodiversity as more niches became available for different forms to inhabit. Species that required protection found refuge within the tighter spaces, while others adapted to the outer surfaces where interaction with open water remained constant. As these reef systems expanded, the relationships between organisms grew more interconnected. Feeding patterns linked species together in ways that extended beyond simple exchanges. Some grazed along the surfaces, removing growth and maintaining balance within the structure. Others filtered particles from the water passing through, while still others preyed upon those that moved between these roles. Each interaction contributed to a network that relied on the presence of many different forms to remain stable. This interconnectedness allowed energy to move through the ecosystem in layered pathways. Rather than following a single direction, it circulated through multiple channels, passing from one organism to another in sequences that overlapped and intertwined. A change in one part of this system could influence others, sometimes indirectly, as shifts in population or behavior altered the availability of resources across the network. The reef itself acted as both habitat and participant within this system. Its growth depended on the organisms that built and maintained it, while its structure influenced how those organisms interacted. The relationship was reciprocal, each shaping the other over time. As layers accumulated, older portions became part of the foundation, supporting new growth that extended further into the water column. Within these environments, specialization became more pronounced. Certain species adapted closely to specific roles, aligning their structures and behaviors with particular aspects of the reef. Some fed exclusively on materials found within its surfaces, while others relied on the movement of water around it to capture suspended particles. This degree of specialization allowed for greater efficiency, but also created dependencies that tied organisms closely to the continued presence of the reef. Movement through these spaces required adjustment. Larger organisms navigated the outer edges, where room allowed for broader motion, while smaller forms occupied the internal passages, moving within the protected architecture. These differing scales of movement added another layer of complexity as interactions occurred both within confined areas and across the surrounding open water. The development of these reef systems marked a shift toward more complex ecological relationships. Life was no longer distributed evenly across the environment, but concentrated within structures that supported a wide range of interactions. These systems did not remain static. They changed as organisms grew, died, and were replaced, their forms continuously reshaped by the living processes that sustained them. In this setting, the ocean carried a new kind of organization, one defined by connection and structure. The reefs stood as focal points within this broader landscape, where diversity and interaction combined to create ecosystems that were both resilient and sensitive, capable of sustaining a wide array of life while remaining closely tied to the conditions that allowed them to exist. At first, movement through these waters carried a certain heaviness, not in effort alone, but in the way bodies interacted with the medium around them. Early fish advanced with steady, deliberate motions, their forms shaped more for stability than for speed. Progress was measured, direction changes gradual, and the surrounding space allowed for this slower rhythm to persist without constant disruption. Over time, subtle alterations began to reshape how these bodies engaged with the water. Fins, once simpler extensions, developed into more refined structures, capable of generating controlled thrust and precise adjustments in orientation. Their placement along the body became more coordinated, allowing for balance between forward motion and stability. With these changes, movement gained a new quality, one that favored responsiveness as much as endurance. This refinement did not occur in isolation. As some organisms became more capable of accelerating and turning, others encountered new pressures that required similar adjustments. The relationship between movement and survival grew more direct, linking the ability to control position with the outcome of encounters. Speed alone was not sufficient. It had to be paired with the capacity to change direction quickly, to navigate through shifting conditions with accuracy. The bodies of predators reflected this shift with increasing clarity. Musculature aligned more closely with the axis of movement, allowing energy to be transferred efficiently along the length of the body. Tails became more effective in generating propulsion, their shapes adapting to push against the water with greater force while minimizing resistance. These changes produced a style of motion that could transition between steady travel and rapid bursts, creating a wider range of possible responses during interaction. Prey species, in turn, adjusted their own patterns of movement. Those that could not match speed sought other forms of evasion, but many began to develop similar capabilities, refining their own fins and musculature to escape more effectively. The space between organisms, once navigated with relative ease, became a dynamic field where timing and precision played a larger role. Movement itself became a form of communication, a signal of intent, presence, or avoidance. As these capabilities spread, the overall character of the ocean began to change. Activity increased, not through constant motion, but through the frequency and intensity of interactions. Organisms moved with greater purpose, their paths intersecting more often as feeding, avoidance, and exploration drew them into shared spaces. The environment no longer supported a predominantly slow rhythm. Instead, it accommodated a range of speeds, from steady cruising to rapid, momentary acceleration. This shift influenced how energy was used and distributed. Faster movement required greater expenditure, linking feeding success more closely to the ability to secure resources efficiently. In this way, the refinement of motion became tied to broader ecological patterns, shaping how organisms balanced effort with reward. Efficiency, control, and adaptability all contributed to how life persisted within this increasingly active system. The transformation did not erase the presence of slower forms. Some continued to move with measured pace, occupying roles where speed offered less advantage, yet they existed alongside a growing number of species for whom movement had become a central feature of survival. The contrast between these approaches added depth to the environment, creating layers of interaction that varied across different regions and conditions. In this evolving landscape, the ocean carried a new sense of motion, one defined not by constant activity, but by the potential for rapid change. Bodies that could respond quickly shaped the flow of life around them, and through their movement, the water itself became a space of shifting paths and intersecting trajectories, where speed and control guided the unfolding of each encounter. Before contact ever occurred, there were signals, faint shifts carried through water and light, traces of movement that reached outward from every body long before it was seen or touched. In this expanding network of interactions, the ability to detect these subtle changes became as important as strength or speed, shaping a quieter layer of adaptation that unfolded alongside more visible forms. Vision began to take on a more defined role within this environment, though it differed from what would later develop in clearer or more stable conditions. Light underwater bends, scatters, and fades with depth, creating a world where contrast and motion matter more than fine detail. Early eyes adapted to these constraints, becoming sensitive to shifts in brightness and direction rather than precise shapes. This allowed organisms to register movement across short distances, providing a brief but meaningful window in which to respond. Alongside this, another system emerged that did not rely on light at all. Running along the sides of the body, networks of sensory cells formed what is now understood as a lateral line, a structure capable of detecting vibrations and pressure changes in the surrounding water. These signals traveled through fluid-filled canals, translating disturbances into information about nearby movement. A passing body, a sudden change in flow, or even the displacement caused by a turning organism could be perceived through this system, offering awareness beyond the limits of sight. Together, these sensory pathways created a layered perception of the environment. Vision provided a sense of direction and motion where light allowed, while the lateral line extended awareness into spaces where visibility diminished. Neither system functioned in isolation. Instead, they combined to form a more complete picture, allowing organisms to respond to changes that might otherwise remain undetected. This growing sensitivity influenced behavior in subtle but significant ways. Movement became more deliberate, not only in execution, but in anticipation. An organism could adjust its path before direct contact, altering speed or direction in response to signals that indicated presence nearby. These adjustments did not guarantee avoidance or success, but they introduced variability into encounters, creating moments where outcome depended on perception as much as on physical ability. Predators benefited from this awareness as well, refining their approach to reduce detectable disturbances, while prey species evolved responses that minimized the signals they produced. The interaction between these opposing needs shaped how bodies moved through water, influencing posture, fin motion, and even the timing of activity. In this way, sensory systems extended their influence beyond detection into the very patterns of movement and behavior. Within groups, these systems allowed for coordinated responses that emerged without direct contact. A shift detected by one individual could propagate through others, creating a collective adjustment that moved through the group in a fluid, continuous manner. This shared sensitivity added another layer to how organisms interacted, linking individuals through the medium that surrounded them. As these capabilities developed, the ocean became a space where much of the interaction occurred beyond immediate perception. Movements carried signals that extended outward, and organisms learned to interpret these signals in ways that improved their chances of persistence. Awareness was no longer limited to what could be seen or touched. It expanded into a field of invisible information, where subtle changes in water and light shaped the unfolding of each encounter. In this quieter dimension, the foundations of more advanced sensory systems were laid, not through sudden transformation, but through gradual refinement that allowed life to perceive its surroundings with increasing depth and nuance. Beneath the visible patterns of movement and form, there were quieter influences at work, carried not in shape or motion, but in the composition of the water itself. Dissolved within it were elements that determined how bodies functioned, how energy was sustained, and how far life could extend its reach. Among these, oxygen played a central role, its presence shaping the limits of activity in ways that were not immediately seen. The amount of oxygen within the ocean did not remain constant. It shifted over time, influenced by changes in climate, by the growth of plants on land, and by processes occurring within the water itself. In some periods, levels rose, allowing organisms to support more demanding forms of movement and growth. In others, they declined, placing constraints on what could be sustained, particularly for larger or more active bodies. These fluctuations created conditions that favored certain traits over others. When oxygen was more abundant, organisms could develop greater size and sustain higher levels of activity, their systems supported by the increased availability of this essential element. Movement could be maintained for longer periods, and interactions between species could occur with greater intensity. In contrast, when oxygen levels decreased, these same demands became more difficult to meet, and forms that required less energy or operated at a slower pace found greater success. The distribution of oxygen within the ocean was not uniform. Variations occurred with depth, temperature, and the movement of water, creating regions where conditions differed even within relatively short distances. Some areas held higher concentrations, supporting a wider range of activity, while others became limited zones where only certain forms could persist. These gradients influenced where organisms could live, shaping patterns of distribution that were guided by invisible boundaries. Over time, life responded to these conditions through gradual adaptation. Structures and behaviors that aligned with the available oxygen became more common, while those that depended on conditions no longer present began to diminish. This process did not require abrupt change. It unfolded through small adjustments, each one contributing to a broader alignment between organism and environment. The relationship between water chemistry and evolution extended beyond oxygen alone. Nutrients, minerals, and other dissolved elements also played roles in shaping how life developed. Together, these factors formed a complex system where chemical composition influenced biological possibility. The interaction between these elements created a framework within which adaptation occurred, guiding the direction of change without direct visibility. These influences operated continuously, affecting every level of the ecosystem. From the smallest organisms to the largest predators, each was connected to the conditions of the water that surrounded them. Activity levels, growth rates, and even patterns of interaction were shaped by the availability of resources carried within the ocean itself. Because these forces were not immediately apparent, their effects can seem subtle when viewed from a distance. Yet over long periods, they left clear imprints on the structure of life. Shifts in oxygen and other elements contributed to changes in diversity, in the size of organisms, and in the balance between different forms. They acted as underlying drivers, guiding the evolution of systems that appeared, on the surface, to be shaped only by visible interactions. In this way, the ocean was not only a space of movement and encounter, but also a medium defined by its internal composition. The chemistry of the water formed a quiet foundation, one that influenced what life could become, shaping its possibilities through conditions that remained unseen, yet ever present within the flow of the world. Closer to the seabed, movement softened into a different rhythm, one that did not rely on pursuit or sudden change, but on steady contact with the surface below. Here, the water carried fine particles that settled over time, forming layers of sediment, rich with organic material. Within this quiet accumulation, a separate world unfolded, shaped less by direct interaction and more by the gradual flow of matter through the environment. Organisms living along this boundary adapted to conditions that favored patience over speed. Their bodies often remained low against the seafloor, spreading weight or anchoring lightly to maintain position. Some moved slowly across the sediment, leaving faint traces behind them, while others remained nearly still, relying on the movement of water above to bring resources within reach. Feeding did not require rapid capture. Instead, it involved processing what had already settled, drawing nutrients from the fine mixture of decomposed material and microscopic life. This method of sustenance created a system where energy moved at a slower pace. Rather than passing quickly from one organism to another through direct consumption, it filtered gradually through layers of life that interacted with the sediment itself. Each organism played a role in breaking down, redistributing, or absorbing what was available, contributing to a cycle that unfolded over extended periods. The result was an ecosystem that maintained continuity through steady processes rather than abrupt exchanges. Within these environments, diversity emerged in forms suited to this mode of existence. Some species developed structures that allowed them to sift through sediment efficiently, separating usable material from the surrounding substrate. Others extended appendages into the water just above the seafloor, capturing particles as they drifted downward. There were also those that burrowed, moving beneath the surface, where conditions differed slightly and offered protection from disturbances above. The contrast between this world and the more active regions of open water became increasingly distinct. While predators above navigated a space defined by speed and direct interaction, life near the seafloor followed patterns that emphasized continuity and persistence. Encounters between organisms still occurred, but they unfolded within a context where movement was measured and outcomes were less immediate. This difference influenced how organisms responded to change. In the slower system of the seabed, adjustments could occur over longer intervals, with gradual shifts in population or behavior reflecting changes in available resources. Stability, though not permanent, was maintained through the steady recycling of material, creating a balance that relied on ongoing processes rather than constant competition. At times, these two worlds intersected. Material from above would settle downward, linking the more active regions to the quieter systems below. Larger organisms occasionally passed through or interacted with the sea floor, introducing brief disturbances that rippled through the sediment. Yet these moments did not redefine the overall character of the environment. They were absorbed into the existing rhythm, leaving the underlying patterns intact. In this layered structure of the ocean, life near the seafloor provided a foundation that supported the broader system. It processed what accumulated, redistributed energy, and maintained a continuity that extended beyond individual lifespans. Though less visible in its activity, it remained essential, offering a different expression of survival, one grounded in steady interaction with the material world beneath the water's surface. Within certain lineages, structure began to shift inward, reducing the need for extensive external reinforcement and redistributing support through lighter, internal frameworks. Instead of relying on thick outer layers for protection and stability, these fish developed skeletons composed primarily of bone within the body, allowing their outer surfaces to remain less burdened. This transition altered not only how these organisms were built, but how they moved, how they grew, and how they interacted with the surrounding water. Internal skeletons provided a balance between strength and flexibility that external armor could not easily achieve. Bones arranged along the length of the body supported muscle attachment in more efficient patterns, enabling coordinated movement that translated energy into motion with reduced resistance. This arrangement allowed for smoother propulsion and finer control, as different parts of the body could bend and respond independently while remaining structurally supported. With this increase in flexibility came a shift in how energy was used. Heavily armored forms required greater effort to maintain movement, their mass limiting both speed and endurance. In contrast, these bony fish could sustain activity over longer periods without the same level of expenditure. Their bodies interacted with the water in a way that reduced drag, allowing them to navigate a wider range of conditions with less strain. This efficiency extended beyond movement into other aspects of life, influencing how they fed, avoided danger, and occupied space. The reduction of external armor did not eliminate protection entirely. Instead, it redistributed vulnerability, placing greater emphasis on movement, awareness, and positioning as means of survival. These fish were not built to withstand force in the same way as earlier armored forms. Rather, They adapted to reduce the likelihood of direct confrontation, using their improved mobility to avoid threats and access resources more effectively. As these traits accumulated, they gave rise to lineages that would continue beyond this period, forming the foundation of many modern fish groups. The internal skeletal structure allowed for further diversification, as variations in shape and function could be explored without the constraints imposed by heavy external coverings. This adaptability supported a range of ecological roles, from active swimmers in open water to more specialized forms occupying distinct niches. The transition from armored dominance to these more flexible designs did not occur abruptly. It unfolded gradually, with both forms existing alongside one another for extended periods. In some environments, armored fish continued to thrive, maintaining their presence where their traits remained advantageous. In others, the efficiency and adaptability of bony fish allowed them to expand, gradually occupying spaces that required sustained movement and responsiveness. This overlap created a quiet shift in balance. There was no single moment when one group replaced the other. Instead, the change emerged through accumulation as small advantages compounded over time. The distribution of species began to reflect these differences, with bony fish becoming more prevalent in certain regions and roles, their presence expanding without immediate displacement of others. Through this process, the foundations of later marine ecosystems were further shaped. The rise of bony fish introduced a form of design that could be modified and extended in numerous directions, supporting continued evolution in ways that aligned with changing conditions. Their emergence marked not an end to earlier forms, but a transition towards structures that would carry forward, influencing the composition of the ocean in the eras that followed. A different kind of presence began to trace longer paths through the water, not defined by weight or rigid structure, but by a smooth continuity of motion that seemed to persist even when direction changed. These early sharks carried bodies shaped for flow, their outlines tapering in ways that reduced resistance and allowed movement to extend with minimal interruption. Their form did not rely on mass to assert itself. Instead, it worked with the surrounding medium, aligning structure with the currents they passed through. At the core of this design was a skeleton composed of cartilage, lighter and more flexible than bone, capable of supporting motion without imposing unnecessary constraint. This internal framework allowed their bodies to bend with greater ease, transferring force along their length in a way that maintained momentum rather than dispersing it. Each movement built upon the last, creating a continuity that favored sustained travel over brief bursts of effort. Their fins contributed to this efficiency, positioned and shaped to stabilize and guide without disrupting the flow they generated. The tail, in particular, became a central source of propulsion, its motion producing forward thrust with a rhythm that balanced strength and economy. This combination of features allowed early sharks to move through a range of environments, adjusting speed and direction with a control that reflected both structure and coordination. Unlike forms that depended on short, forceful actions, these swimmers could maintain activity across longer distances, covering space with a consistency that opened new possibilities. They were not confined to limited regions or brief encounters. Their movement allowed them to explore, to follow, and to respond across broader areas, linking different parts of the environment through their presence. This capability influenced how they interacted with other organisms. Rather than relying solely on proximity or chance, they could engage with their surroundings in a more continuous manner, adjusting their paths in response to subtle cues and maintaining contact with areas where resources were available. Their efficiency reduced the cost of movement, allowing them to balance energy use with opportunity in a way that supported persistence over time. As these traits accumulated, their advantages became more apparent within the shifting dynamics of the ocean. In environments where adaptability and endurance carried increasing importance, the streamlined design and flexible framework of early sharks provided a foundation that aligned well with these demands. They did not immediately replace existing dominant forms, but they expanded into roles where their approach offered distinct benefits. This expansion occurred gradually, without abrupt displacement. Other groups continued to occupy their positions, yet the presence of these efficient swimmers began to alter the balance. Their ability to move consistently and respond to changing conditions allowed them to persist through variations that might challenge more specialized or heavily structured forms. Over extended periods, this persistence contributed to a broader pattern of success. The qualities that defined these early sharks supported a form of resilience that extended beyond immediate conditions, allowing them to adapt as the environment continued to evolve. Their design did not depend on a narrow set of circumstances, but could be adjusted and refined as new pressures emerged. In this quiet progression, the foundations of a long lineage were established. The features that shaped their movement and structure would continue to develop, carrying forward into later forms that would come to occupy more prominent roles. What began as a subtle presence, defined by efficiency and flow, moved steadily toward a position of lasting influence within the unfolding story of the ocean. Near the margins where water met exposed ground, the boundary between two worlds narrowed into a shifting edge, a place where depth gave way to shallowness, and the surface above drew closer with each gradual change in terrain. In these regions, certain fish began to encounter conditions unlike those of open water, where movement was interrupted by uneven substrates and the presence of air altered the balance of their surroundings. Among them, lobe-finned fish carried structures that differed from the more streamlined forms seen elsewhere. Their fins extended outward with a fleshy base, supported by internal bones arranged in patterns that allowed for a degree of weight bearing. These fins did not function as limbs in the modern sense, yet they provided a capacity to press against solid surfaces, offering stability in environments where swimming alone was no longer sufficient. Shallow waters presented a unique set of challenges and opportunities. The depth could fluctuate, sometimes leaving portions of the body exposed or reducing the space available for free movement. In these conditions, the ability to support weight, even briefly, became advantageous. Lobe-finned fish could push themselves along the substrate, adjusting their position in ways that relied less on continuous swimming and more on controlled contact with the ground beneath them. This interaction with solid surfaces marked a subtle but significant shift in how movement was expressed. Instead of relying entirely on the surrounding water for support, these organisms began to engage with their environment in a more direct manner. Their fins acted as points of contact, distributing weight and allowing for short, deliberate motions across uneven terrain. These movements were not sustained journeys onto land, but they represented an early exploration of a different mode of locomotion. The environments where this occurred were often transitional, areas where water and land intermingled in complex patterns. Tidal influences, seasonal changes, and local variations in elevation created spaces that were sometimes submerged and sometimes exposed. In such settings, the ability to move between water and land, even over short distances, offered access to resources and refuge that might otherwise remain out of reach. As these behaviors persisted, gradual changes accumulated within the structure of the fins themselves. Bones became more defined, joints more capable of controlled movement, and the coordination between muscles and skeletal elements improved. These modifications did not arise with a specific goal, but they aligned with the demands of the environment, reinforcing traits that allowed for greater interaction with solid ground. The transition from water to land did not occur as a single event. It unfolded through a series of small steps, each one building upon the last. Lobe-finned fish did not abandon the water, nor did they immediately establish themselves on land. Instead, they occupied a space between, where both environments influenced their form and behavior. Within this gradual progression lay the foundations of terrestrial life, the structures that supported limited movement on solid surfaces would, over time, develop into more specialized limbs, capable of bearing weight and enabling more extended travel. The interaction with air, the adjustment to new sensory conditions, and the changes in movement all contributed to a broader transformation that would continue long after these initial steps. In these quiet margins, where water thinned and ground emerged, life began to extend beyond its original domain, carrying forward the first indications of a transition that would reshape the living world in ways that reached far beyond the shoreline. On land, change gathered slowly at first, not through movement, but through stillness that began to take hold across exposed surfaces. Small plant forms, once confined to damp margins, extended further outward, their structures adapting to support life above the ground rather than within it. From these beginnings, vascular plants emerged, carrying internal channels that allowed water and nutrients to move upward, freeing them from constant reliance on direct contact with moist substrates. This internal transport system altered the scale at which plants could exist. Stems grew taller, lifting photosynthetic surfaces toward light, while roots extended downward, anchoring into the developing soil and drawing resources from below. These roots did more than support the plant itself. As they penetrated rock and sediment, they contributed to the gradual breakdown of these materials, initiating processes that would lead to the formation of more complex soils. As these plants spread, they began to cluster, forming early forests that introduced a new vertical dimension to the landscape. Layers of vegetation created shaded regions beneath their canopies, altering the conditions experienced at ground level. Moisture was retained differently, temperatures moderated, and wind patterns shifted as these structures interrupted the open flow of air. The land, once largely exposed, became textured with areas of cover and variation. With this expansion came an increase in oxygen production. Through photosynthesis, these plants released oxygen into the atmosphere, contributing to a gradual rise in its concentration over time. This change did not occur abruptly, but it accumulated across vast stretches of time, influencing both terrestrial and marine environments. Higher oxygen levels supported more active forms of life, extending the range of what organisms could sustain in terms of movement and metabolism. The presence of plants also influenced the cycling of carbon, drawing it from the atmosphere and incorporating it into organic structures. When these plants died, their remains became part of the developing soil, adding layers of organic material that further enriched the ground. This process linked the growth of vegetation with the transformation of the land itself, creating a feedback loop where plant life and soil development reinforced one another. Climate began to respond to these changes in subtle ways. The distribution of vegetation affected how heat was absorbed and released, while the increase in atmospheric oxygen and the reduction of carbon dioxide contributed to shifts in temperature over extended periods. These changes were not uniform across the planet, but they introduced new patterns that influenced both land and sea. The formation of soil altered how water moved across the surface. Instead of flowing quickly over bare ground, it began to be absorbed and retained, supporting further plant growth and stabilizing the environment. This retention reduced erosion in some areas while enabling the development of more complex terrestrial ecosystems. Small organisms followed, finding shelter and resources within this emerging structure. These developments on land did not remain isolated. Rivers carried materials from the soil into the ocean, introducing nutrients that influenced marine systems. In this way, the transformation of the continents became connected to changes in the water, linking two environments that had previously followed more separate paths. Through the steady growth of vascular plants and the formation of early forests, the planet's surface underwent a gradual redefinition. The land gained structure, the atmosphere shifted in composition, and the interaction between earth, water, and air took on new forms. What began as modest growth expanded into a process that reshaped the conditions under which life would continue to evolve. Movement across the land remained faint at first, almost easy to overlook against the stillness of growing vegetation and exposed ground. Yet within this quiet surface, small forms began to appear, tracing brief paths between patches of shelter and moisture. Early arthropods, carrying jointed limbs and segmented bodies, ventured into spaces that had only recently become suitable for sustained presence above the water. These organisms did not arrive into a fully formed environment. The land, though altered by plant growth, remained open and uneven, with resources distributed in scattered pockets rather than continuous abundance. Moisture collected in certain areas, and it was within these regions that early exploration took hold. The bodies of these arthropods reflected their origins, still closely tied to conditions that prevented desiccation, yet capable of moving across surfaces that required coordination and balance beyond what aquatic life demanded. Their limbs provided a new way of interacting with the ground, allowing them to lift and place their bodies rather than glide through a supporting medium. This change in movement introduced a different rhythm, one defined by contact and release, by the negotiation of texture and resistance beneath them. Each step connected them to the surface, shaping how they navigated and how they responded to the environment around them. As these organisms spread, simple ecosystems began to form, though they remained sparse when compared to the richness of the ocean. Interactions were limited in number, but not in significance. Some fed on plant material or decaying matter, contributing to the gradual breakdown and recycling of organic substances. Others occupied roles that involved predation on smaller forms, establishing early patterns of interaction that would later expand into more complex systems. These early terrestrial communities did not yet display the dense layering seen in marine environments. Instead, they existed as scattered networks, connected by the movement of individuals and the slow accumulation of organic material. The absence of continuous cover meant that conditions could vary sharply across short distances, influencing where organisms could persist and how they adapted to their surroundings. Despite this simplicity, the presence of arthropods introduced new dynamics to the land. Their activity influenced the distribution of organic matter, while their movement contributed to the mixing of surface materials. In subtle ways, they participated in shaping the emerging soil, interacting with plant roots and microbial life that were also beginning to establish themselves more firmly. The land, though still quiet in comparison to the ocean, began to show signs of increasing complexity. Each addition, whether plant or animal, contributed to a gradual layering of interactions that extended beyond isolated events. The environment did not transform suddenly. It evolved through accumulation, with each small presence adding to the structure that would support future development. Over time, these early explorers would give rise to more diverse and specialized forms, but in this stage, their existence remained closely tied to the conditions that allowed them to persist. Moisture, shelter, and proximity to resources shaped their distribution, while their interactions remained limited yet meaningful within the broader context of a changing planet. In this emerging landscape, the first steps of small life onto land did not create immediate transformation. Instead, they marked the beginning of a slow expansion where movement across the surface introduced new possibilities, and where the foundations of terrestrial ecosystems began to take shape through the quiet presence of these early inhabitants. There was no single moment when the change announced itself, no sharp boundary where one world ended and another began. Instead, the shifts unfolded in fragments, subtle alterations that accumulated across time until the structure of the ocean no longer held the same coherence it once had. What had seemed stable began to loosen, not through sudden collapse, but through a steady thinning of connections. Reef systems, which had grown into intricate centers of life, were among the first to reflect this change. Their structures, built layer upon layer through long periods of growth, began to show signs of decline. The organisms that sustained them did not disappear all at once, but their presence became less consistent, their contributions less continuous. Growth slowed, gaps formed, and the once dense frameworks became more fragmented over time. As these structures weakened, the relationships that depended on them began to shift. Species that relied on the reefs for shelter or food found fewer places to anchor their existence. Some adapted by moving into different regions or altering their behavior, while others declined as the conditions they required became increasingly rare. The network of interactions that had once been tightly interwoven started to separate into smaller, less stable groupings. This process extended beyond the reefs themselves. Across the broader ocean, species began to diminish in number, not through abrupt disappearance, but through gradual reduction. Populations thinned, distributions contracted, and certain forms became less common within the environments they once occupied. These changes were not uniform. Some regions retained more of their diversity, while others experienced more pronounced loss, creating a patchwork of conditions that varied across the seascape. With this uneven decline came a growing sense of instability within the ecosystem. The balance that had been maintained through interconnected relationships became more difficult to sustain. As some species diminished, the roles they fulfilled within the system were left partially unfilled, altering the flow of energy and interaction. These gaps did not always close quickly, leading to further adjustments that rippled outward through the network. The causes of these changes were not singular. Variations in water chemistry, shifts in nutrient availability, and broader environmental influences all contributed in ways that overlapped and reinforced one another. These factors did not operate in isolation, but interacted, creating conditions that were less predictable and more challenging for existing forms to navigate. The ocean, once defined by a growing complexity, began to experience a different kind of transformation, one marked by gradual contraction. Even within this period of decline, life continued to adapt. Some species persisted, adjusting to the changing conditions and maintaining their presence within altered environments. Others began to occupy roles that had been vacated, though often in reduced or modified forms. The system did not cease to function, but it operated with a different structure, one that reflected the ongoing loss and reorganization. This quiet progression did not draw attention to itself in any immediate way. It unfolded beneath the surface, recorded not in sudden events, but in the slow accumulation of absence. Over time, these absences became more apparent, shaping a new phase in the history of the ocean, where continuity gave way to transition, and where the patterns of life adjusted to a world that no longer held the same stability as before. Explanations did not settle into a single cause, but spread across overlapping changes that moved through the ocean in ways that were difficult to trace in isolation. The decline that had begun to take shape was not driven by one force alone. It reflected a convergence of conditions, each altering the environment in subtle ways, yet together reshaping the balance that life had come to depend upon. One of the most influential factors lay within the availability of oxygen in the water. As broader environmental systems shifted, oxygen levels in certain regions began to fluctuate, creating zones where its presence became limited. In these areas, organisms that relied on consistent oxygen supply found it increasingly difficult to sustain their activity. Larger or more active forms were particularly affected as their demands could not be met under reduced conditions. The result was not an immediate absence, but a gradual contraction of where such organisms could persist. At the same time, changes on land introduced new dynamics into the ocean. The expansion of plant life across the continents altered how nutrients were carried into the water. Rivers transported increased amounts of organic material and minerals, enriching certain regions while also disrupting existing balances. In some areas, this influx supported bursts of biological activity that consumed available oxygen more rapidly, further intensifying the conditions of depletion. In others, it shifted the composition of the ecosystem, favoring species adapted to these new conditions. Climate patterns also contributed to this unfolding complexity. Variations in temperature influenced how water circulated, affecting the distribution of oxygen and nutrients across different depths and regions. Warmer conditions could reduce the ability of water to hold oxygen, while changes in circulation patterns altered how it was replenished. These shifts did not occur uniformly, creating a mosaic of environments where conditions varied, sometimes sharply, over relatively short distances. Within this changing framework, the structure of food chains began to experience disruption. As certain species declined or moved into more limited ranges, the relationships that connected different levels of the ecosystem became less stable. Predators found their usual sources of food less reliable, while prey species encountered new pressures or reduced competition, altering their own patterns of growth and distribution. These changes propagated through the network, creating effects that extended beyond the initial points of disturbance. The interaction between these factors produced a system that was increasingly difficult to maintain in its previous form. Oxygen depletion, nutrient shifts, and climate variation did not act independently. They reinforced one another, creating conditions that amplified their individual effects. Areas that experienced reduced oxygen could also be those receiving higher nutrient input, intensifying the imbalance. Similarly, climate influences could alter both oxygen distribution and nutrient flow, linking these processes into a broader pattern of change. Despite this growing instability, life did not cease. Organisms continued to adapt, some finding ways to persist within altered conditions, others diminishing as their requirements could no longer be met. The ocean remained active, yet its structure was no longer defined by the same consistency that had supported earlier diversity. In this convergence of changes, the ocean entered a phase where the underlying systems that sustained it were reconfigured. The causes were not singular or isolated, but interwoven, shaping a transition that unfolded gradually, yet carried lasting consequences for the forms of life that depended upon the balance that had begun to slip away. Their presence, once woven into nearly every layer of the ocean, began to thin in a way that did not immediately signal an ending. The forms that had carried heavy plating and defined earlier balances did not vanish all at once. Instead, their numbers grew uneven, their distribution more fragmented, until the spaces they had long occupied felt less anchored by their weight. Placoderms, among the most recognizable of these armored fish, had once moved with a kind of certainty shaped by protection and force. Over time, however, the conditions that had supported their design shifted beyond the range where those traits offered the same advantage. Their reliance on dense external structures, effective in earlier environments, became a constraint as new pressures demanded different responses. Movement required more energy, flexibility remained limited, and the ability to adjust quickly to changing conditions grew increasingly important. As these pressures accumulated, their decline unfolded gradually. Some populations persisted longer in regions where conditions remained closer to what they required, but others diminished as environments continued to change. The interactions that had once sustained them became less reliable, and the systems they depended upon no longer supported their presence with the same consistency. Unlike lineages that would continue and diversify, placoderms left no direct descendants. Their forms, distinct and specialized, did not transition into later groups. Instead, they receded entirely, their characteristics preserved only in the fossil record. This absence marks a clear boundary in the history of marine life, where a once dominant group gave way without leaving a continuous line into the present. Their decline did not occur in isolation. As they diminished, other groups expanded, filling roles that had been left open. Species with lighter structures, greater flexibility, and more efficient movement began to occupy spaces where armored forms had once prevailed. These organisms did not replicate the exact functions of those that came before, but they adapted to the changing environment in ways that aligned more closely with emerging conditions. This transition reflects a broader pattern within evolution, where dominance is shaped not only by strength or protection, but by the ability to adjust as the environment shifts. The traits that once provided stability for placoderms became less effective as the balance of the ocean changed, while those that allowed for adaptability gained increasing importance. In this way, the replacement of one group by another did not arise from a single advantage, but from a collection of characteristics that aligned with new demands. The disappearance of armored fish altered the structure of the ecosystem. Without their presence, interactions between species shifted, and the flow of energy moved through different pathways. The absence of a dominant group created space for diversification, allowing other lineages to expand and explore roles that had previously been limited. What remains of these armored forms is a record of a time when their design defined the boundaries of marine life. Their rise and eventual fall illustrate how conditions shape the success of different structures and how even the most established groups can recede when those conditions change. In their disappearance, there is no abrupt ending, but a gradual transition where presence fades and absence takes its place, leaving behind a quieter ocean that continues to evolve, shaped by those that remain and those that have passed into the deeper layers of time. What remained did not rise through sudden dominance, but through continuity, a steady persistence, carried by forms that could adjust without losing their balance. In the shifting structure of the ocean, certain lineages endured not because they were the most protected or the most forceful, but because they could respond as conditions changed, altering their behavior and form in ways that kept them aligned with the environment around them. Among these survivors, sharks continued their gradual refinement. Their bodies, already shaped for efficient movement, adapted further as pressures within the ecosystem evolved. Subtle changes in fin structure, sensory systems, and feeding strategies allowed them to occupy a widening range of roles. They did not rely on a single method or habitat. Instead, they extended across different regions, their presence becoming more consistent as they aligned with the demands of a changing ocean. At the same time, bony fish expanded in number and variety, their internal skeletons supporting a diversity of forms that moved through different layers of the water. Some remained small and numerous, forming schools that shifted collectively through space, while others developed into larger, more specialized hunters or grazers. Their flexibility allowed them to explore niches that had been less accessible to heavier, more constrained bodies, filling gaps left behind by those that had receded. This diversification did not occur in isolation. As these groups expanded, they interacted with one another in increasingly complex ways, forming connections that contributed to the emerging structure of the ocean. Predation, competition, and cooperation all played roles in shaping how these species coexisted, creating a network of relationships that reflected both continuity and change. Within this evolving system, the foundations of modern marine ecosystems began to take form. The patterns of movement, feeding, and interaction established during this period carried forward, influencing the organization of life in later eras. The ocean did not return to its earlier state. Instead, it transitioned into a configuration where adaptability held greater value than rigid protection, and where flexibility allowed for sustained presence across varying conditions. The shift from armor to mobility and efficiency marked a broader change in how success was defined within the ecosystem. Structures that could adjust, that could support a range of behaviors and responses, proved more resilient as environmental conditions continued to fluctuate. This did not eliminate the role of protection entirely, but it reduced its dominance as the primary strategy for survival. Over time, these adaptable forms came to define the character of the ocean more clearly. Their presence shaped the flow of energy, the distribution of species, and the interactions that connected different parts of the ecosystem. They were not identical to the forms that exist today, but they carried the essential features that would continue to evolve into modern lineages. The survival of these groups illustrates how evolution filters possibilities, not by selecting a single ideal form, but by favoring those that can persist through change. In this process, flexibility becomes a form of strength, allowing life to navigate conditions that cannot be predicted or controlled. Through their continued evolution, sharks and bony fish established a direction that would extend far beyond this period. Their persistence did not mark an end, but a continuation, one that carried the ocean forward into new configurations, shaped by the quiet selection of traits that allowed life to endure and adapt within an ever-changing world. Survival, when viewed across vast stretches of time, does not follow a single rule, yet patterns begin to emerge when the presence of some forms continues while others fade. The difference is not always visible in the moment. It becomes clearer only when conditions shift, revealing which structures can persist through change and which remain tied to a narrower range of circumstances. Adaptability plays a quiet but central role in this process. Organisms that can adjust their behavior, their movement, or even their internal functions in response to changing environments tend to maintain continuity across longer periods. This flexibility does not require constant transformation. It often exists as a range of possible responses already present within the organism, allowing it to operate under varying conditions without losing stability. In contrast, specialization offers a different kind of success. When conditions remain stable, Highly specialized forms can achieve remarkable efficiency. Their structures and behaviors align closely with specific roles, allowing them to use resources in ways that broader forms cannot match. For extended periods, this precision can support dominance within particular environments, shaping the surrounding system in ways that reinforce their position. The challenge arises when the environment begins to change. Specialized traits, while effective within a defined context, can become limiting when that context shifts. An organism adapted to a narrow set of conditions may find fewer opportunities to adjust when those conditions no longer apply. In such cases, survival becomes more difficult, not because the organism lacks strength or efficiency, but because its design is closely tied to a world that is no longer present. Environmental change does not occur uniformly. It can involve alterations in temperature, chemistry, resource availability, or the presence of other species. These changes may be gradual or uneven, creating a landscape where conditions vary across regions and over time. Organisms that can navigate this variability, either through movement or through internal adjustment, are more likely to persist within the evolving system. Evolution operates within this context as a filtering process. Variations that support survival under new conditions are carried forward, while those that do not gradually diminish. This filtering does not act with intention. It reflects the outcomes of countless interactions between organisms and their environment, each contributing to the overall direction of change. Over long periods, this process shapes patterns of survival that extend beyond individual species. Lineages that maintain a degree of flexibility tend to branch and diversify, exploring different ecological roles while retaining the capacity to adjust. Those that remain highly specialized may achieve success for a time, yet face greater risk as conditions continue to evolve. The distinction between these paths is not absolute. Many organisms exist along a spectrum, combining elements of specialization with forms of adaptability that allow them to respond to certain changes. The balance between these traits influences how they persist within the broader system, shaping their likelihood of continuing across different phases of environmental transformation. In this way, the presence or absence of a species reflects more than its immediate capabilities. It represents an alignment between its structure and the conditions it encounters over time. Survival is not determined by a single moment, but by the ability to remain connected to a world that is always shifting, where persistence depends on how well form and environment continue to meet. Balance, in the way it might appear at a glance, never truly settles into permanence. What seems stable within a single moment is held together by interactions that are already shifting beneath the surface. The ocean carries this instability as part of its nature, not as disruption, but as a continuous process where change unfolds quietly, without a fixed endpoint. Across long spans of time, patterns emerge that reflect this ongoing movement. Groups rise in number and influence, shaping the structure of their environment, only to diminish as conditions alter. This rise and fall does not follow a simple rhythm. It varies in pace and intensity, sometimes extending across millions of years, sometimes occurring through more compressed intervals, yet always contributing to a broader cycle that defines the system as a whole. Within these cycles, dominance is never absolute. A group may hold a central position within the ecosystem, influencing interactions and distribution, but this position remains tied to the conditions that support it. As those conditions change, even gradually, the advantages that sustained that dominance can begin to shift. Other forms, once less prominent, may find alignment with the new environment, allowing them to expand and take on roles that were previously occupied. This transition does not erase what came before. Elements of earlier systems persist, sometimes in reduced forms, sometimes integrated into new structures. The ocean does not replace its past entirely. It carries it forward, reshaping it into configurations that reflect current conditions. In this way, each phase contributes to the next, creating continuity within change. The interactions between organisms drive much of this transformation. Predation, competition, and cooperation form connections that respond to shifts in population and environment. As one species expands or declines, the effects ripple outward, influencing others in ways that extend beyond direct contact. These relationships create a network that adjusts continuously, maintaining function even as its composition evolves. Environmental factors reinforce this dynamic. Variations in temperature, chemistry, and resource distribution alter the conditions under which life operates, guiding which traits are favored and which become less effective. These influences do not act in isolation. They combine with biological interactions to shape the direction of change, creating a system where physical and living processes remain closely intertwined. Within this framework, the ocean becomes a space defined by transformation rather than stability. Movement, interaction, and adaptation occur at every level, from the smallest organisms to the largest structures within the ecosystem. Each component contributes to a pattern that is never fixed, yet remains coherent through its capacity to adjust. The absence of a permanent balance does not imply disorder. Instead, it reflects a form of organization that depends on flexibility, where the ability to respond to change maintains continuity across shifting conditions. Life persists not by holding a single state, but by moving through a sequence of states, each connected to those that came before and those that follow. In this ongoing process, the ocean carries a history written through change, where each rise and fall leaves an imprint that shapes what comes next. The system remains active, not in sudden upheaval, but in a steady progression that continues to redefine the structure of life within it, guided by the constant interplay between environment and adaptation. What remains from this distant time is not always visible in form, but present in structure, carried forward through lineages that continue to shape life long after the original bodies have disappeared. The legacy of this age does not rest in the creatures themselves, but in the systems they established, the anatomical frameworks that became part of a deeper continuity extending into the present. Jaws, once emerging from subtle modifications of earlier structures, became a defining feature across vertebrate life. Their ability to grasp, process, and manipulate food opened pathways that extended far beyond the ocean. Over time, these structures diversified into countless variations, each adapted to different roles, yet all connected by a shared origin. From the feeding mechanisms of modern fish to the complex arrangements found in terrestrial animals, this development continues to influence how life interacts with its environment. Internal skeletons, refined through earlier transitions, provided another foundation that endures. The arrangement of bones supporting movement, protecting vital organs, and enabling growth established a framework that could be modified across generations. This flexibility allowed for the emergence of a wide range of forms, from aquatic swimmers to land-based organisms capable of supporting their weight against gravity. The patterns set during this period persist, guiding the structure of bodies that now inhabit environments far removed from those early oceans. Sensory systems also carry this inheritance, the capacity to detect movement interpret signals, and respond to subtle changes in the surrounding world evolved into increasingly complex networks. Vision adapted to different conditions, while systems sensitive to vibration and pressure informed awareness beyond what could be seen. These early developments laid the groundwork for perception as it exists today, influencing how organisms navigate, communicate, and survive within their environments. The influence of these features extends through all modern vertebrates, linking present forms to their distant origins. Each adaptation, refined over time, contributes to a continuity that spans across vast stretches of history. The differences between species may appear significant, yet beneath these variations lies a shared framework that traces back to these early innovations. This continuity reaches even into human evolution, though its presence is often subtle. The structure of the human jaw, the arrangement of the skeleton, and the organization of sensory systems all reflect a lineage that extends into this ancient period. These elements have been reshaped and refined, adapted to new contexts and functions, yet they retain the imprint of their origin. In this way, the connection between past and present is carried within the body itself. The legacy of this age does not dominate the surface of modern life, yet it remains embedded within it. It operates quietly, forming the basis upon which later developments have been built. Without these foundational changes, the diversity of vertebrate life, including the forms that exist today, would not have taken the same shape. Through this inheritance, the age of fishes continues to influence the present, not as a distant memory, but as an active component of living systems. Its contributions persist in the structures that support movement, in the mechanisms that allow interaction, and in the patterns that guide development across generations. The ocean of that time may have transformed, but the innovations it produced remain, carried forward in ways that continue to shape the unfolding story of life. In present waters, far removed from those early formations, certain patterns continue to unfold with a familiarity that does not draw immediate attention. Movement, interaction, and structure appear modern, yet within them are traces that extend back through deep time, carried forward not as direct replicas, but as refined continuations of earlier designs. Modern fish, in their varied forms, retain elements that originated during those distant periods. The arrangement of their jaws, the articulation of their fins, and the organization of their internal structures all reflect foundations that were established long before the current shape of the ocean emerged. These features have been modified, adjusted to new conditions and roles, yet their underlying principles remain consistent, linking present life to its earlier origins. The dynamics between predators and prey also persist, following patterns that mirror those from ancient systems. Pursuit and evasion continue to shape interactions, guided by speed, awareness, and positioning. Some species rely on sudden acceleration, others on concealment or coordination, yet the balance between seeking and avoiding remains a defining feature of life beneath the surface. These interactions do not replicate past events directly, but they follow similar principles, suggesting a continuity in how life organizes itself under shared constraints. Within these patterns, evolution reveals a tendency to revisit certain solutions. Forms that prove effective under particular conditions emerge again, sometimes in different lineages, shaped by similar pressures. Streamlined bodies appear where efficiency in movement is required, while sensory systems refine in response to the need for awareness within complex environments. These repetitions do not indicate a fixed path, but rather a range of possibilities that life explores when faced with comparable challenges. The persistence of these traits creates a subtle presence of the past within the present, It is not immediately visible, yet it influences how organisms move, interact, and survive. The ocean carries these echoes through the continuity of structure and behavior, embedding history within the living systems that exist today. Even as environments have changed, with shifts in climate, geography, and biodiversity, the foundational patterns remain recognizable. The relationships between organisms continue to reflect the balance between energy acquisition and conservation, between risk and survival. These relationships are shaped by the same underlying principles that guided earlier ecosystems, adapted to new conditions, but grounded in familiar dynamics. The repetition of these patterns does not imply that the past is unchanged. Each iteration introduces variation, influenced by differences in environment and lineage. Yet, within this variation, there is a continuity that ties present systems to those that came before, creating a layered history that exists within the current structure of life. In this way, the ancient ocean remains present, not as a separate memory, but as an active component of the modern world. Its influence persists through the traits and behaviors that continue to define marine life, shaping interactions in ways that reflect a deep and ongoing connection. The surface may appear different, the forms more refined, yet beneath these changes lies a continuity that carries forward the patterns established long ago, allowing the past to remain embedded within the present, guiding the unfolding of life in ways that are both subtle and enduring. There was a time when the structure of life itself was still being arranged, when the ocean carried forms that would not endure, yet would leave behind something far more lasting than their presence. This distant interval marked a turning point, not through a single moment, but through a gradual reshaping of what life could become, setting conditions that would continue to influence every era that followed. During this period, entire groups rose into prominence and then quietly disappeared. Their absence might suggest a closed chapter, yet the changes they introduced did not vanish with them. The development of jaws, the refinement of internal support, and the emergence of more responsive sensory systems continued forward, carried by lineages that adapted these features into new forms. What ended was not the innovation itself, but the specific expressions that first embodied it. As these transitions unfolded, life did not pause or reset. It moved forward, shaped by the structures that had already taken form. New groups emerged within the frameworks that earlier organisms had established, modifying them in ways that allowed for greater flexibility and resilience. The ocean, once defined by different dominant forms, began to reorganize around these inherited systems, gradually shifting toward the patterns that would define later ecosystems. The world that followed did not resemble the one that came before, yet it was built upon it in ways that remain deeply connected. The interactions between organisms, the movement of energy through ecosystems, and the structures that support life all reflect a continuity that extends back to these earlier conditions. Even as species changed and environments shifted, the underlying principles remained, guiding the development of new forms within familiar constraints. In this sense, the Devonian Ocean did not simply pass into absence. Its influence persisted, embedded within the evolving systems that replaced it. The creatures that once dominated its waters are no longer present, yet their contributions remain active, shaping the possibilities available to life long after their disappearance. This continuity allows the past to exist within the present, not as a visible layer, but as a foundation that supports everything built upon it. The ocean that exists today carries these foundations within its structure. Its inhabitants move through environments shaped by processes that began long ago, following patterns that have been refined over immense stretches of time. The forms are different, the arrangements more complex, Yet the origins of these systems remain traceable to those earlier transformations. When viewed in this way, the distance between past and present becomes less distinct. The differences are clear, yet the connections remain, linking modern life to conditions that once seemed entirely separate. This continuity reveals a world that has changed profoundly while still carrying the imprint of its earlier states. The Devonian Ocean, though no longer present in its original form, continues to matter through the legacy it has left behind. Its influence persists in the structures, interactions, and patterns that define life today, shaping a world that continues to evolve, carrying forward the results of changes that began in waters far removed from the present moment.